The minimum wage debate explained. Finally, we're going to get to the second thought video. Friend of
This
the show
episode and others like it are made possible
friend of the show, Second Thought, made a video on the minimum wage
by the
debate.
generous
Let's
support
take a
of my
look.
patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help me make more content like this and get early access to every new video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. Every few years and pretty much constantly over the last half decade or so, the US enters a cataclysmic debate over the federal minimum wage. Some people think
Oh my god, I love that he immediately started with Stossel, dude. John Stossel is so bad. It's great.
raising the wage would destroy businesses and raise prices for goods and services. Others think it's essential to keep up with inflation and rising housing prices. Both sides firmly believe that their position is the one supported by hard data and evidence. But there are certain realities surrounding this debate that are never addressed. So in this episode, I'm going to address them. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be more informed on the minimum wage debate, but more than that, you'll have a new understanding of why it's such a divisive issue in the first place. Let's start with some basic history. Once upon a time, there were no regulations regarding how much bosses had to pay their workers. This was back in the early 1900s, and because of this wild west of a labor market, those who owned the factories could pay their workers as little as they wanted. And if those workers didn't
The good old days, boys. You know, free market enterprise. Where enterprising individuals with a tidy sum of intergenerational wealth could just start a business and work their workers to the bone. Work faster, you plebes.
like it, they could quit, and other starving Americans would gladly take their place. This worked out wonderfully for the owner class. They knew that a desperate working population would have little choice but to accept the tiny wages they offered, because the alternative was abject poverty and starvation.
Which is, of course, very different than today, as you know.
Over the years, labor laws were established to help prevent this predatory behavior, and in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the country's first minimum wage, a system that had already been implemented in other developed nations. This legislation also banned the use of exploitative child labor, which had been an incredibly lucrative.
I mean, these are very important tools and skills that these kids are learning. It's all right. You got to get them used to it. You got to get these children used to the black lung early on.
Lucrative practice for early 20th century business owners. The owner class was not happy about this, but millions of parents across the country were relieved that they would receive better wages and that their children would no longer be torn to pieces by the massive, dangerous machines the business owners forced them to crawl into to fix. Almost 30 years later, in 1960,
I can't stress this enough. Republicans of today are literally the same kinds of conservatives that unironically defended child labor back then. It is unimaginable to think. You think like, what? No, that's not true. No, literally, it's the same operating principle. Conservatives back then defended child labor, wanted child labor to continue, and just like they still defend, free market enterprise and no fucking no economic equality initiatives, no fucking economic justice whatsoever. It's the same guiding principle, the principle of conservatism.
An amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act raised the federal minimum wage to $1.60 per hour, and extended coverage to federal employees and some farm workers for the first time. This particular amendment is a critical bit of historical evidence, because, as we'll see later, a recent study made some important findings regarding the minimum wage and employment. Now, let's take a look at how the minimum wage has changed over time. 6 decades ago, in 1960, the minimum wage was $1 per hour. Over the following 60 years, the wage steadily rose, today sitting at $7.25. Taken by itself, this graph looks pretty good. The line goes up. Here's the problem. Just listing dollar amounts without historical context does not give an accurate depiction of what those amounts mean. Let's look at the same line adjusted for inflation. That's a lot less impressive. These peaks and troughs represent each time the minimum wage has been raised, and inflation wiping out those gains. Taken as a whole, we can see that compensation for minimum wage workers is actually significantly lower today than it was 60 years ago. This peak here, representing the 1966 amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act, marked the high point of the US federal minimum wage. $1.60 an hour in 1966, adjusted for inflation, equates to almost $13 an hour today, nearly twice our current minimum wage. Okay, so we know that real compensation for workers is lower than it was in the past, but this is where we get to the crux of the matter. Many people don't care that it's lower because they believe that a minimum wage should not be a living wage, that you should not be able to support yourself on this wage because jobs that pay that little are meant to be beginner jobs.
So minimum wage should be $12.75? No, because when adjusted to, I think, $7.50 since then and how much inflation has increased, it gets even higher.
Or things to keep retirees occupied. Let's talk about that. Do students and other young
$100 an hour minimum wage KEKW? Again, incredible argument, dude.
people make up the bulk of minimum wage workers? Yes. Are they typically able to rely on their parents for housing? Yes. Does this mean that they don't need more money in order to simply survive? In many cases, yes. Does that mean we should allow their compensation to slip so far behind the rate of inflation that their pay has next to no value? No. Justifying poverty wages simply because many minimum wage workers are students is not a valid reason to keep paying so little. And the minimum wage is a poverty wage. According to several studies, there's not a single county in the entire nation where a minimum wage earner could afford a one-bedroom apartment. If the minimum wage had simply kept up with inflation and productivity gains since 1968, it would be over $24 per hour today. That's a lot of surplus labor value that's been taken from workers and given to their bosses. Unsurprisingly, the owner class is almost uniformly opposed to raising the minimum wage at all.
By the way, minimum wage increases by age. If you look at workers, this is from back in 2012, but it was 20% back in 2012. 20% of the workers were 16 to 19 years old, and the 80% of workers at that point were over the age of 20 that were relying on minimum wage. That number is, I think, increased a lot more too.
But what's more disappointing is seeing people who make $16 per hour fighting with people who make $7.25 an hour when their bosses make thousands of dollars per hour. There's a certain mindset in America where people believe if I just scrimp and save enough, if I work enough overtime, if I do what I'm told, if I just work hard enough, one day I'll be the one making thousands of dollars per hour. Of course, the owner class is thrilled by this. When the working class is divided, those who make twice the minimum wage fighting against lower wage workers earning even a single dollar more, it makes the capitalist job that much easier. Remember, the people making $16 an hour are still making less than what the minimum wage should be if it had just kept up with inflation and productivity. But let's set this aside for now, and address some of the common objections to raising the minimum wage. We'll begin with the objection that raising the minimum wage will increase housing prices. I would start by asking those people, when was the last time you rented an apartment? I imagine it was quite a while ago. It's understandable then that these people are a little out of touch with the realities of housing prices in the rental market. The federal minimum wage has not been raised since 2009. Between 2010 and 2020, the average apartment rental price has increased by 40%, and by much more than that in some areas. Let me repeat that. The price for housing has increased by 40%, while the minimum wage has increased by 0%. So
That's so weird, dude. Huh.
To the people saying raising the minimum wage will increase housing prices, that has already been happening without raising the pay to a living wage. The minimum wage has nothing to do with rising prices in housing or in any other area. When people say your Big Mac will cost $30 if the wage goes up, they're clearly not familiar with McDonald's pay in Denmark. If you work at a McDonald's in Denmark, your starting pay is $22 per hour. You also get 6 weeks of paid vacation, life insurance.
Disgusting communism, dude. Literally disgusting communism. I hear $22 an hour in Denmark, and I'm just... I anger myself. I'm foaming out of the mouth thinking about these disgusting commies in Denmark. How much does that burger cost? Tell us, second thought.
Year of paid maternity leave and a pension plan. Their Big Mac costs 27 cents more than in America. 27 cents is apparently the difference between respecting your workers and considering them stupid, morally deficient, low-skill workers. The argument that raising the minimum wage will increase prices on housing and goods has no basis in reality. Let's move on to probably the most...
There's no way I'm paying that, folks. I'm sorry. That's goddamn un-American. This is just like George Orwell, 1986, paying 27 extra cents for a Big Mac. Oh! Or let me do it from the liberal point of view. Sweaty, actually, you're not taking into consideration poor people who need to have a healthy diet of 3 Big Macs per day. And that 27-cent increase is significantly going to harm their budgets, okay? Budget shortfalls are real, Sweaty. Why aren't you thinking about the poor?
Common example. Raising the minimum wage will drive companies out of business. On the surface, this is a valid concern. Many small businesses do operate on razor-thin margins, and an increase in employee compensation could in theory make their business untenable. Let's return to that study I mentioned earlier. In September of 2020, a new report was published that examined the effects of the minimum wage increase as part of the 1966 Fair Labor Standards Act amendment. Their findings? Earnings rose sharply in all affected industries, the racial wealth gap was significantly diminished, and, most importantly for this discussion, there was no adverse effect on employment. Businesses could afford to pay their workers more, they just didn't want to. It's no stretch of the imagination to assume that the same is true today, especially when tax breaks for businesses and the wealthy have increased dramatically since the 80s, coincidentally, the period since which worker compensation has stagnated. So, based on historical precedent, there's no reason to assume that increasing the minimum wage would drive companies out of business, especially when some of the largest employers of minimum wage workers are huge.
I just don't get why it doesn't raise the prices, though. Do execs just make less from Denmark? Can you explain? I'm trying hard to understand. Yes, it cuts into their fucking profit margin. They still profit, but just not as much as they do in the United States of America. That's literally what we are supposed to do. When people say, oh, dude, this is actually going to make shit more expensive, they're talking about how McDonald's will make the decision, the educated decision, to transfer the cost over to the fucking consumer. There is a pool of funds that you can transfer the cost onto, okay? And that pool of cost is your profit. That's maybe less of a marketing budget, maybe less of a fucking R&D budget overall, and certainly a smaller budget for the board executives, okay?
Hugely profitable megacorporations like Walmart and McDonald's. But let's return to the hypothetical that's so often used on pro-business news outlets. The mom-and-pop family business that simply can't afford to pay their workers anymore. Here's the thing. If you cannot afford to pay your workers a living wage, you should not be in business. This is how the free market is supposed to work, remember? Your
like, also true.
business is at the mercy of the market. If you don't make enough...
When you say, oh, sorry, I can't pay my workers a living wage if there is an increase of the minimum wage, how is that argument any different than, sorry, I can't, like, exist without having child laborers? Or, sorry, my business falls apart without, like, literally enslaving people. Well, okay, then your business fucking sucks. It's unethical to begin with.
enough money to cover your expenses, by free market logic, you should not be in business. Paying your workers is the most basic expense of all. Again, the minimum wage should be over $24 per hour. If you can't pay your workers a third of that rate, that means the only reason you're in business is because you're exploiting people by paying them poverty wages. This is the entire basis for the existence of the gig economy.
I don't think the rent price point is fair. Landlords will definitely raise price because there's no broad rent control in this country. The price of goods point makes sense. Dude, okay, but that's a separate problem that needs to be addressed with legislation or some sort of fucking restriction, some sort of regulation. You get that, right? We can't raise the minimum wage because it'll just immediately go to landlords is not a good fucking argument. You're talking about a separate problem as addressed by Second Thought, even before he addressed the rent control thing, even before he addressed the price of rent increasing. Some marketplaces have seen a 40% increase in rent without with a 0% increase in fucking minimum wage. Why did that happen?
So accustomed to devaluing workers that companies like Uber no longer even classify their workers as employees, so they can get away with paying them nothing at all. But let's give small business owners the benefit of the doubt here. I'm going to assume that you genuinely want to run an ethical business that pays its workers fairly. I can understand how it would be a challenge to raise your workers' pay from whatever you're paying them now to $15 per hour all in one chunk. Wouldn't it make more sense if instead of having to raise the minimum wage by large amounts every decade or so, we chose to raise the wage every year based on inflation and other metrics? This would make the change more gradual and manageable, the workers would be paid fairly, and it wouldn't put undue stress on you, the business owner. Other countries already do this. Instead of leaving the minimum wage in the hands of politicians, in countries like France and Australia, economic commissions reevaluate their minimum wage every year, raising it to match critical economic signifiers. It's no coincidence that countries that take this common sense approach also have a higher minimum wage relative to the average worker's salary. Unsurprisingly, the US ranks dead last by this metric. Okay, so let's assume you're on board with the idea that workers should at least be paid a living wage. That inevitably leads us to the next objection. If the minimum wage goes up, they might make more money than other low-paid workers, like teachers. I'm going to ask you to think about that statement for a moment. If minimum wage workers earn more money, say $15 per hour, still less than what the minimum wage should be, they might make more money than teachers. I would suggest that there's an easy solution here. It's
Increase the fucking prices, increase the wages for teachers.
not to demand that the minimum wage stays the same, it's to demand that all low-paid workers get a raise. This goes back to the strange American delusion that one day you'll be rich. No. If you're a teacher, a janitor, if you work a trade, if you're in retail, if you sell hours of your life for a wage, you're in the same boat as minimum wage earners. You both deserve to be paid more. In 2020, the federal government spent over $720 billion on the military, and that was just the base budget. When you account for other aspects of the so-called defense budget, you get numbers that are alarmingly close to $1 trillion. $1 trillion in a single year. More money than the next 10 nations combined spend on their militaries. There's not a country on Earth that could even come close.
Listen, buddy, that's to protect the world, okay? We need more of that. Otherwise, it's George Orwell, baby.
To threatening the US. And yet we spend all this money on submarines and aircraft carriers and billions of tons of bombs. We have the money to fully fund our schools, invest in new public projects, and improve the lives of all Americans. Our priority—
Yeah, but we're the richest country, so what we do is the best. Being the richest country is completely fucking meaningless if a significant chunk of your population doesn't even have fucking $400 in emergency spending, that are living paycheck to paycheck.
Are just out of alignment with what the country actually needs. Walmart made over $129 billion in profit last year. Supermarket chains saw an increase of over 39%.
The irony of the American wealth is that, like, even when it comes to, okay, the funniest thing about American wealth is that even our billionaires are wealthier than the rest of the world's billionaires, right? We have the wealthiest billionaires in the world, except we don't have the most billionaires per capita. Norway has more billionaires per capita than the United States. Sweden has more billionaires per capita than the United States. We're not even fucking spreading the wealth amongst the billionaires. Even our billionaires are like, nope, I'm going to have most of it. How fucking insane is that, by the way?
In their profits during the pandemic, while their workers, whom the companies labeled essential, saw little to no increase in pay, despite putting their lives on the line for their employers. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and a handful of their billionaire friends increased their net worth by $1 trillion over the same period. These people make more money in a single hour than the average person will earn in a lifetime, and we're squabbling over giving our lowest paid workers an extra $7 an hour? There is a sickness in—
My man said that's because they have less population. Brother, what do you think per capita means, dude? What the fuck? Yo! He said that's because they have a smaller population, dude.
In America that has been programmed into us over the last 4 decades. We are conditioned to be hyper-competitive, to see earning a living as survival of the fittest, to rely only on ourselves and see others' hardship as evidence of some moral failing. This pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality has seeped into our national consciousness and completely poisoned our outlook on labor. Like most discourse around money, the minimum wage debate—
Have you gone over the topic of CBO projecting 1 to 3 million jobs lost by 2025? The minimum wage is increased to $15. One, I haven't seen. We looked at it briefly yesterday. That same report also shows 2 to 3 million people will be lifted out of fucking poverty. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. So clearly, it's better overall. And secondly, again, minimum wage and its decrease to job loss has been, and I hate to do this like because conservatives do it all the fucking time, but according to studies that literally look at other fucking studies, most of the studies conducted on minimum wage decreases or minimum wage increases leading to job loss are heavily biased in the way they source it. Yes, a meta-analysis, a meta-study. What stops companies increasing prices to adjust to the according to minimum wage? Even if companies were to adjust prices in accordance to a raise in the minimum wage, what you have to remember is that cost is shared by billions of fucking people. And therefore, that price increase, as they have already shown in this video, is minuscule in comparison to the actual increase in wages that will lift people out of poverty.
Debate boils down to the fact that Americans are so conditioned to be entirely individualistic that they feel personally attacked when someone else's income inches even a cent closer to their own. It's hard to overcome this.
Also, this happens routinely where people advocate to increase minimum wage. Seattle's a perfect example of this, where there is immediately a litany of economists that come out of the woodwork and scream about how job loss is going to occur. Job loss is going to occur. And then a couple years later, those economists are nowhere to be found because their prediction came out to be completely untrue.
This mindset. The propaganda of suicidal self-reliance and hyper-individualism makes it incredibly difficult to watch other people succeed. Because deep down, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, watching our fellow workers succeed makes it feel like we have failed. At its core, the minimum wage debate isn't just about the minimum wage. It represents a sort of proxy for all class consciousness in America. There's no easy answer here. The process of deprogramming an entire population will be a massive undertaking. But the first step must be a renewed understanding of class struggle. If you are a worker, whether you're in retail, food service, transportation, whether you're young or old, from New York or Alabama, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you sell hours of your life for a wage, you are working class. The owner class, the people who own the massive corporations, the restaurants, the car dealerships, the people who pay your wage and make million-dollar donations to corrupt politicians, they have a vested interest in paying you as little as possible, because that will maximize their profits. The struggle is not you versus your fellow workers, but all workers versus the obscenely wealthy owner class who refuse to allow America to become the country they claim it is. A country that works for all Americans, not just those at the very top. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind
The source for billionaires per capita comes from, drumroll please, the motherfucking American Enterprise Institute, where a person in the American Enterprise Institute, which is literally a reactionary shithole think tank, was trying to make the argument that Bernie Sanders is fucking wrong, and Bernie Sanders supporters are fucking wrong, and that Norway is not the communist paradise that Bernie Sanders and his supporters think. So they actually ended up owning themselves by showing that there were more billionaires per capita in Sweden and Norway in the social democracy, because they are not fucking communist, obviously, or nor are they socialist, but the social democracies, which are still capitalist, in Norway and Sweden, there are more billionaires per capita than the United States. That is the absolute best own you can fucking make, because then you could say, well, look at that. Norway and Sweden, they haven't fucking executed their billionaires, and yet seemingly they're doing fine as far as their economy goes, and they're seemingly doing fine with a comfortable living wage that they can offer to nearly every single fucking individual. Why can't we be more like Norway in the short term? Stop saying Sweden doesn't have minimum wage if you don't know that union collective bargaining agreements encompass nearly the entirety of their fucking labor force, and a minimum wage would actually lower their negotiated wages. If you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, either shut the fuck up and learn a thing or two, or you're going to look like an asshole and I'm going to fucking dunk on you. In America, 11% of our labor force is unionized. Okay? 11%. Collective bargaining agreements do not encompass nearly the same percentage of the labor force in the country as they do in countries like France, which have a comparably lower rate of unionization in the workforce, but still have nearly the majority, if not all, of the labor force protected under those same collective bargaining agreements. 11% of this country is unionized. That is 4% lower than the rate of unionization in a country like Chile, a country that our economists have fucking literally destroyed. A country that is seen as the neoliberal testing grounds has a higher percentage of unionization than our fucking country. How crazy is that? What is your stance on removing a minimum wage as a whole? Dude, did you literally just tune in?